The Mudflood and the Great Fires. More understanding and evidence. So, most people, when you start talking about these things, they've never heard of this mud flood. But when you look back, they've all it's all in your subconscious mind about the digging up of the Sphinx and the pyramids and all that stuff. Another big thing is the Easter Island buried statues. And everywhere, whether it's the Easter Island or Egypt, there's always the same amount of coverage of mud or dirt or earth or whatever happened. And when people start to dig out these structures, they go on much deeper than just at the top. So there is lots of evidence to support this realm wide mud flood event. And the Easter Island heads is a big part of that because at some point they thought they were just, you know, from the shoulders up. And then when they go start digging them up, they find, they go down 20 feet in the mud and they're actually full bodied statues. So that's a big thing, a big clue, a big piece of evidence. These super giant, multiple ton stones buried, and the story is they were buried by the people who did it, but they didn't bury them all the way. So it's very interesting. If you look at the outer landscape, what else might be down 20 feet under the mud if they really start digging this out? And when you see them digging these statues out, it's like so much work just to dig out one statue. Imagine how much work it would be to dig out an entire giant building. That's a big part of looking at all of this, examining the evidence, and re examining kind of the stories that we were told about them, the native people either burying these statues or the idea that there was this giant event realm wide that buried all these civilizations, all these statues, all the buildings, all of the people under the mud, 20, 30, who knows how many feet down it is. Now here's another thing I have found at I believe this is at the Stonehenge, and around the surrounding areas, there's these buried stones. But if you can look at the little diagram, it really the mud fossil aspect of these fossilized creatures start to really come into play, and how big things were, and if you dug out these heads, would there be bodies attached to them? Most likely there would be, but they would never want to acknowledge that there were creatures or beings or people of this size. So you can get into more of once you start examining the landscape and understanding that these giant creatures were everywhere, giant people, then you get into the idea of geology and how they have created all these time periods millions and millions of years ago, which is a complete fabrication because they don't want to acknowledge or understand the buried buildings, the buried artifacts, the pyramids, all these kind of things that are buried way below the depths of their supposed geology layers. It never really it doesn't really go together. They you can't have 400 million-year-old dinosaur bones and all these layers of geology at a level where the buildings are buried much, much deeper than that. So, how did the million-year Jurassic, Triassic layer get at one level when, they find the bones of the Jurassic time period and the buildings are always much deeper than where they're digging up these supposed fossils and bones and stuff? So it goes into the idea there are many historical records and documentation of these massive flooding events. Now, most likely regional flooding areas or like 100-year storm flooding is not the same thing as this worldwide biblical type flooding where the entire realm is covered in mud. And the same goes with the pyramids in um Mexico City, or there's multiple ideas and existence of these pyramids that are buried or disguised as mountains or burial mounds. When the Native Americans would call them burial mounds, most likely there was a giant person, creature, something that had died and was stinking, so they covered it with dirt to kind of mask the scent of the rotting corpse and stuff. Now, this is called this Tum Tum Mountain in Washington State, and it is just a mountain. Trust what the narrative says, trust what the expert says. There's no way this is a giant pyramid in the middle of Washington State. Now, the more you look and the more you go around, realm wide, these pyramids exist, and there are these giant, you know, mud flood covered pyramids in China. They're in Russia. They're throughout our realm are these pyramids. And this one even looks like it's still got the white quartz on the outside, just covered in the mud. So it's all waiting to be excavated. It's waiting to be explored. The history that could be within these pyramids that haven't been excavated, like the pyramid in Egypt, would further the idea that this was a realm wide super civilization. And then this event happens, and you can see slowly them re-getting things back going again. Now this picture is really interesting, and this is kind of how all this works. Is there's one old world brick building sticking out of the ground. They know there is they can see the building sticking out of the ground, obviously, but they would also know the building would go down 20, 30 feet and then possibly into a deeper basement location. And this is how they would pull off all of their cloning operations of the foundlings and the orphan trains and stuff. And the controllers know what's under the ground and how deep the structures go. So you can also look at this picture and see no trees are growing, because most likely the trees wouldn't have been growing within a super liquidy mud type area. So when the ground settles, it stops moving, they can then move forward to access this old world brick building. And then, if there was some kind of an underground train system or some kind of transportation system in the basement levels of these old world brick buildings, they would know they can then set up a town, and you can see how these settlers actually build. It's almost identical to how we build today, but once again, there's no trees, so there would be no lumber. So all of the lumber and supplies would have to be brought in. And if you look at this old world brick building sticking out, people don't really understand is when it starts raining in these locations, the mud gets so thick you cannot walk through it. And I got this a lot where I live is a couple weeks of rain and you go walk off any kind of pathway and you just sink down into your boots with the mud. It gets so liquefied. And that's a big part of this mystery is how long before they could build a structure that wouldn't sink in the mud. And then we go further into this research of this mud flood takes place. I would imagine some cities and towns, if they were at a certain elevation, may have been protected from this mud deposits. Maybe they were only flooded with water, and you don't see the widespread dirt covering up brick streets and stuff like that. Now look at the streets also, once again going into the idea of how many bricks we're talking about. And these cities are completely empty. There's no one in these cities. Going over, you can see how they buried all these buildings. You can see how There's no way if it takes them that long to dig out the Easter Island statues, how long is it going to take to dig out this brick building? Where would you put the dirt? How would you haul all the dirt? The idea they built these buildings and dug out these basements and stuff, it's just a complete unacceptable theory. Completely a fraud. We understand looking back, the more people look into this mystery of the mud flood, mystery of Tartaria, the mystery of all these things, you find abandoned cities, and then these orphan trains would slowly arrive. When they would set up a frontier town or something, it would be close to these super city locations where they could access the lower levels into the basements, the sub basements, to wherever the central location underground is where these trains would have been running. And you don't really see this until you start seeing it. And then you will see these buried buildings, the mud flooded windows, the same kind of architecture everywhere, and how the amount of work it would take by these very small people with very limited technology, supposedly no electricity, no internal combustion engines. They would have just been redeveloping steam engines to kind of make steam shovels and things like that. But it's very interesting how digging out these buildings would have been just a monumental task of digging out some of these structures. And this is where you get into it would have been so much easier just to pave a new road on the top and install your the narrative that you built the windows half underground for lighting in the basement because they didn't have any electricity. So they didn't have electricity, but they were able to dig the 3 or 4 stories of mud and start brick building and all this stuff at the same time when in the winter months you're not doing any building because of the cold weather, the snow, the mortar and the stuff wouldn't set up. This If there was snow in that area, that would limit your transportation of getting to this work site and doing all of this masonry work, creating these superstructures, and on top of that, the finishing out of the inside with the hand carved woods, the paintings and murals on the ceilings, and all this kind of stuff. It really pushes more evidence to the fact that there's a lot of stuff buried under the ground. Now, throughout North America, you see these giant mounds, and these mounds most likely are a type of pyramid structure, some type of a landing pad, maybe. Um, we don't really understand. They tell us it was a burial tomb for some pharaoh or something. But the more you look into the amount of these pyramids, their kind of ideas kind of go out the window, and we see more and more of these little pockets of civilization that have been maybe not wiped out, maybe they were covered in water. It depends on kind of the elevation of some of these sites. And we look into 1860, all of this stuff was still covered in mud, and they haven't yet dug them up. And this is where you get into the multiple waves of the incubator babies and the child clones. Every 5, 10 years, there's a new crop because they're continuously growing these. But the orphan trains were very active in 1820, 1850, 1870, and 1890. And then things were to the point where they could kind of mask their operations more, where you have the cloned population or the child orphans or whatever so distracted working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, no one's ever going to kind of catch on to kind of what's going on. Now, then you get into the deception of the Jews and Israel. If the Jews had been living in Egypt for centuries as slaves, surely they would have noticed the pyramids and the Sphinx. Strangely, neither of these great architectural wonders of the world are not mentioned once. So, where did all of these biblical accounts really take place? Where did these biblical stories come from? If you see them all completely buried in 1860, how long were they buried for? Were they buried for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years? What causes? We can kind of start to identify possibly when these events took place. But once again, it's not just Egypt, it's realm wide. You find buried structures and things like that. And in most towns, they'll have some kind of a mudslide or something, and you find these old world train tunnels and these pneumatic tunnels and stuff. So it's really hard to discount all of this evidence. One or two things you might have a cover story for. The big one is the Civil War. All these structures were made in the Civil War and then buried up because it was a failed tunnel. And I mean, if you have the resources to start a project like building these super underground tunnels for miles and miles without electricity, hauling all the bricks down by hand, all these different factors. It the main thing that we are proving is that they're lying. And our original story is a complete lie and fabrication. And right under the surface, sometimes it's down another level, but they are always finding access points. If you're into like urban explorers on the YouTube or something, they're constantly going deeper and deeper and deeper. And the amount of earth removed really should make people question the amount of technology and resources that were available to these old world people at the time. Once again, kind of going to the idea that all of these super cities and these kingdoms were maybe 3D printed. Possibly there's a biblical aspect to all of these buildings as they were built in the heavens and then delivered down to the earth realm. And a whole super city would have been created in just a few days when you have the high technology of the astral realms or something like that. Which you could think, what are if we've lost 1,000 years of our story, and 1,000 years from now, what kind of technology will we be able to 3D print giant super cities and have it cost almost nothing because you're making the bricks on site out of the ground, you're mixing them, they're 3D printing as they go, and they can almost print anything they could think of or program into a computer or something. So here's one of these buildings that they have dug out, and you can see granite foundation 16 feet to the ground to the surface. And then you go deeper and deeper, and you start to see how the sandstone sub foundation and just the way everything's built perfectly on scale, everything's built level down to a certain specific level. Now, where exactly is the ground level? How deep before we get to this ground level? If the seas rose, possibly by the cutting down of these trees, possibly by the crashing of an extraterrestrial spaceship. If you can imagine a Death Star type sized cube or something crashing into the earth, that causes the ocean levels to rise, possibly causing this mud flood event. We can theorize to multiple causes. Maybe they're all part of the same cause and all of these things happen at the same time. But it's very, very interesting how much is concealed under our feet, how much the general public has no clue about any of this. You show them all these things, you tell them it was built in the Civil War, and they just whatever that you tell them, they just go, yeah, okay. They are not interested in any of this research. They couldn't care less about how much bricks are under the ground. They're constantly putting in new buildings and digging into the building the footings and the foundations of these buildings and finding massive structures under all of these towns. And the right when you think you hit the bottom, they discover a new level, a new architecture, and it's just if if there was no population at the time, For instance, in California, if California becomes a state in 1850 in the gold rush, and there's just barely a population of settlers and stuff, and yet they have time to make these super monolithic buildings and all this stuff and all the bricks, and it's very interesting. We look, we find more information, we find more bricks, we find deeper and deeper buildings, and it just kind of keeps going. This is why others theorize there's going to be another great reset event, because more and more people are finding out kind of what went wrong, what happened, and the controllers, whether they're human or non-human intelligence, whether they're an artificial type intelligence, whatever it is, they know that they've been found lying nonstop. And when we all, as a collective species of people, as a collective mankind, as a collective group of researchers, put this information together, the less people you have believing their narratives and their stories. So we know this mud flood event happened. It's very widely accepted in our communities that this is a reality. And anytime an expert is brought in, they just give you the pre-programmed responses. They really don't have anything to say, and everything is a coincidence, or that's just how it was. The records to how they built all these big buildings and bricks and all how many loads of bricks, how much mortar was used, how much cattle was used to transport the bricks, how much food did the cattle eat, how much hay were they ordering, how much workers were there, what were you paying the work, all these records magically get destroyed in these great fires, which we're going to talk about that in just a second. But when you understand this is everywhere, every single pocket of civilization on Earth, you'll find this type of architecture, you'll find these half buried windows, you'll find lots of examples of this, whether you're in New York or Chicago or San Francisco or Seattle or Moscow or Paris. This is everywhere. So eventually, someone, researchers, explorers, there's so much left to explore if we can find the access points deep within the, secret elevators of these buildings, and we can get into these underground superstructures. When certain people, this is where the secret societies come in, and the masons and all these people, they're the ones who have access to these underground areas. Now, not all of them, but the higher level people who are running your town, the judges, the chiefs of police, the chiefs of the fire, they would all kind of understand some of this information and where to get into these access points. And a big clue is you have to identify the similarities in all of these pictures. What buildings are similar in town to town? If you were, an old world person from 1870 and you just stumbled onto this super mega city with no people, which buildings would you explore? And what might you find at the deeper and deeper levels? So it's just a lot of these pictures don't make any sense when you understand the detail of these buried cities and all this stuff. And this is why a lot of, if it's not directly tied into a giant city like a New York or something, they could have built a lot of dams and lakes and things like that to submerge an entire town or a city. And this is where you get into the Operation Paperclip aspect after World War One, when these controllers all get into the governments and start creating dams and all this hydroelectric power to conceal many of these things that cannot be explained and possibly may be explored at a later date. So here you see survivors exiting our realm. That's what we're thinking. Now, this is supposedly one of these great expos, and they built all of this giant building without any kind of brick roads or anything. It's almost as if all the last pockets of survivors are going to these locations to access the last available underground transport systems out of our realm. And they all are wearing fancy clothes and they all got their hats and all this stuff. It's just putting yourself into the position of these people. You're going to see this giant super building and no one ever like planted a couple trees to like eat lunch under or anything. It's just very bizarre. Questioning any one of their narratives really focuses a person's mind to the fact that they don't have any answers. They have no clue. They found all these pictures the same way we have found all these pictures, and they create a story surrounding a picture. So, you understand that if you did have these giant blimps and stuff, and you're just flying back and forth across the continental United States looking for these giant buildings and stuff, you find a giant building, you then claim the building as the founder, the person who founded the building, and you found this building, and then you would, set up frontier town in order to slowly repopulate where you can be in control of the people doing whatever these people do. And it's just imagine if you're the person who finds Washington, D.C., or one of these other cities, and you claim all of the property within it. You claim the money and the safes, the gold, the whatever it is. It's just the pictures tell a different story when you understand the scale of these things. Now, this is the Lincoln Memorial, and it's just a building sticking out of the dirt in a far location. It makes no sense. This is a swampland. How are you getting in here to build a structure? How heavy is this structure that's not sinking in the mud? It's very firmly in the ground and surrounded by mud and all this stuff. And you can see this right here looks like it could be some type of a corpse or something of one of these giants sticking out of the ground. Very, very interesting when you understand the other stories that we see. Now, if you had no prior knowledge of any of this, you would just believe whatever they told you. To where now that we question things and we understand that they have lied and that they are lying, this is how we uncover more and more. And by looking at these old photographs and things like that, you can almost know other locations to dig. And throughout all these old pictures and these black and white photos, you see the remnants where at this time period, it would have been almost impossible for them to hide all this stuff. The bricks sticking out of the ground, the archways, the amount of wasted materials to build something underground, and then, the next year it floods, and well, they had to raise the sidewalks again. It's really, really ridiculous. But we will crack this mystery and we will find these answers. But it's like waiting for a Trump or an Elon Musk or Vladimir Putin to level with the people, and we're in the age of disclosure and all this stuff, and not one of these people will acknowledge any part of this historical mystery of all these things. What caused this mud flood? What happened? When was civilization got back on track? Now, here in this picture, you can see another right under the topsoil. A farmer is plowing a field. He hits this giant rock. They start digging it out and they find a massive wall. Now, if you look in the picture below, that's where the outline of this wall is. So massive, built right under the ground. And it's just another one of these historical mysteries. No one knows why they built a giant wall under the ground and then covered it with dirt at the equal depths all the way around it and stuff like that. And then you start to question the Great Wall in China and all these other great walls and all these other great things that they have found. It's more questions that we have where they are not applying any more answers. Now, here's another weird structure built into the ground. I don't know where a lot of these pictures are, but it's just like, look how big this is, built underground. How did you dig up all of the dirt? And if you did build this and dig out the dirt, where did all the dirt go? Shouldn't there be a massive amount of dirt equal to the size of the structure under the ground? And it gets weirder and weirder and weirder, and you can see how the lines kind of all match up as if it was some kind of 3D printed. I mean, it's like the people of today don't make anything this fancy and nice. It's all very hurry it up and get it done as fast as you can to move on to the next project. It's not like take your time and make things as nice as you can. You're paying these people supposedly a bowl of soup a day or whatever they're paying the settlers at the time. Not enough for them to afford shoes. You look at the older pictures, and a lot of people aren't wearing shoes, which it's just so many questions pop up when you're looking at this. Now, here's a guy, I mean, just out in the middle of nowhere on the side of a cliff, you start to see these giant columns in the dirt buried. And if it's not columns, this is the side of uh the tower in Paris. And underneath you can see bricks, you can see archways, you can see possible connections to the old world flying machines and the blimps and the zeppelins, and it's just so much information and data accumulated proving that these people are lying, but yet we still let them govern us. They still have power over us. They control our lives in every aspect. They control our debt. They control our food supply. They control our information. They control our media. They control the political aspects of all government. And it's just, at what point do the people all kind of accept this information and say, no, you're not in charge anymore? I don't know how we overcome these obstacles and rediscover these truths. Whenever you went to go start digging, the government comes out of nowhere. This illegal occupying government telling you you're not allowed to investigate by digging into the ground. And it's always because of it was an ancient burial ground. It's for environmental reasons. We can't harm the double-breasted cormorant, whatever bird, subspecies. Like these people do not care about animals and nature or anything. They don't want you to discover the fraud they have uh, placed onto the people as a spell where people just can't see this information. They do not see this information. They do not want to understand or look at any of this information. Whenever you try to show them, you can just see them doing everything in their power to not focus and concentrate. Like the programming is not going to get in. Now, here's a picture of the kind of destruction you see. These massive brick super bridges out of thousands and thousands of bricks just completely blown up and destroyed. And in the background, at the red arrows, you could see this super, super structure built. Now, they could build false walls of a house. There's unlimited ways we've caught them hiding some of these things. And they'll always explain it as that was destroyed in the Civil War, that was destroyed in World War One, that was destroyed in World War Two. And then you get into Vietnam War and firebombing, and it's just one thing after another. Concealment, hiding things, passing off of a narrative and then never talked about again. Now, this picture totally mud flooded out. You can't see anything. You see these few houses. It says the Presidio and Golden Gate from Russian Hills, San Francisco. A lot of their pictures that they're showing you, you really have to. Why would they tell you the truth in some pictures and then not tell you the truth in other pictures? pictures that they are telling you is to form the narrative so that the spell that they have cast onto the people holds place. And you see super mega city in the background and these little shacks. That's about how people build when you don't have complex machines, way of cutting the tin on the roof, whatever. And this is what you see popping up over and over again is mud flood area, tents being brought in, tents being replaced by very basic standard square box lumber houses, and average general public people aren't building a 3-story brownstone house out of bricks with perfectly carved staircases and things like that. So it's just more information that we have that there was this super cataclysm. Something happened which completely ended civilization to the point where everything had to stop and we had to, repopulate the planet by most likely clones and stuff like that. The same thing they're doing today with the, you know, manufacturing robots with wombs that they can grow babies in and all this stuff because they're through their vaccinations and stuff, they've sterilized the entire population. And the next cloned person will be an asexual, genderless person. You'll have they won't have any gender, and you'll create people by just cloning. So male and female, it'll all kind of morph into one, and this is where you get the importance of gender and transgender and trans species, and we're moving towards this next age where all of reality will be controlled. You're not going to be able to breed. You won't have reproductive organs any longer. You'll just have, like the if you've seen Marilyn Manson, the Mechanical Animals music video, where they're just weird genderless things. And that's what the next version of society will be. And this is why they're going to wipe out all of the people through immigration. And when all of their target population is eliminated, mainly the white Christian people or the descendants of this old world Tartary, the only people left will be the black and brown people. And we know that these controllers don't like them either. Any kind of person they don't like, and they'll end up, creating another Spanish flu or something to wipe them out. So there's more evidence, there's more information the more you look. Here's this painting of something, but what caught me on this picture is the type of the levels. If you can see in the coloring of the surrounding areas. Now, this is another picture of the Grand Canyon, but it's got the similar color variations at the base of this area. And it's just certain things you never know what was depicted and what was destroyed by melting lasers, something. Now, this next picture you can see superstructure built, and then they've got a little funky building on the top, which is still way more advanced than we can make. But it just seems like every civilization builds on the ruins of a past civilization. And the deeper you go, the bigger things get, and the more the scale of things seems to really ramp up, and you see another little gateway there in the middle, and you see remnants of super megalithic structures, most likely built by very large humans. Whether they were 30-foot tall or 40-foot tall, that's a major factor in all this. And you go back and you see more abandoned, giant Greco Roman Capitol looking buildings. You see infrastructure and train tracks all kind of abandoned. And what caused the abandonment? Was it so high technology some kind of EMP went off and ended the technology and they had to restart over? We don't really know because of, obviously they haven't told us the truth, but the amount of information that is collected really makes us look several times at all of these things. So, if not by war, then by these great fires. And every single town and city from 1820 to 1920 all experienced these super fires that burnt every structure to the ground, and we see this today as the burning down of Los Angeles, the burning down of all these cities through wildfires, when in reality most likely there's a connection to directed energy weapons. They always have plans for their smart city, and when they start getting their smart city, you'll find that nobody wants to live there, and then they'll, you know, be more lax on cloning technology, and this is where they would start manufacturing their genderless people so that the cloned being can choose what gender they want to be. And it's very, very dystopian and disheartening, and it's very satanic, and it's just void of creation, void of consciousness, void of God's creation, just manufacturing the most basic of buildings and things like that. And when we talk about these great fires, we talk about the melted buildings. We talked about the melted buildings earlier, but it's like there's so much evidence that's going to be lost by the time the general public people start figuring this out. The narrative moves to the next, reset, the next war. We've got to go fight in the Middle East for Israel. And now we got to go to war with Iran. And we went to war with Iraq. And it's just the same controller people sending us to murder people and get murdered ourselves. And nothing ever really comes out of it good for the people. It's just furthering their agendas, furthering their deceptions, and furthering their controls. And the more of us that are gone, the more of our brothers and sisters from God we kill, the further away from God we get, and we never figure out anything. So the destruction of these fires, a question that should be asked is, how are you burning down these massive brick buildings? If the bricks, you know, a pottery kiln is made out of bricks. Ovens are made out of bricks. Fireplaces are made out of bricks. They're made for fire. And then you just see like blast waves hit these old buildings or something, pulse with some kind of, you know, directed energy or something. And just the amount of destruction you see. And then you see these two characters down here at the bottom, which, the one guy in the black has the hidden hand, and the other guy, I don't know if that's supposed to be President Lincoln or what, but just little ant people next to these super buildings. Now, the mega cities of the old world, if not reclaimed or repurposed by the controllers after this mud flood event, they would be destroyed by great fires. And just like how we see today with the directed energy weapon fires, all most likely caused by these directed energy weapons, it's very interesting that, in this picture you see the telephone pole not burned down, and the brick building with the green arrow there, perfect like laser cuts across the building. And you see more and more of these perfect laser cuts, and just, these two characters, figuring out what they could loot from the ashes or something. It just, everything, you got to question everything. Now here's more of these great fire pictures. And if you look at the bricks at the base here, it's just perfect laser cuts. I'll focus on that more in a second. But these great fires take place, and it's such great fire. It's burning down and destroying brick super buildings and stuff. Doesn't make a lot of sense how, this isn't like the buildings of today made with 2x4s. These are all 100% brick buildings. So how are they catching on fire and burning? Unless they were aided by the high technology of these controllers or reclaimed technology of the old world. And it's very selective, the buildings that they get rid of and the buildings that they keep. Now, here you can see the perfect laser cut aspects of these buildings. Perfect straight lines, And does this connect with high technology, like a War of the Worlds type event? Were there massive robots walking around, lasering these buildings out, laser cutting all these buildings, causing all these fires? Within the smoke, you're not seeing the robots or something. We'll get into the future tech at the end, but it's very interesting what is causing these laser cuts in these buildings. Another clue as to if you would imagine they did have this technology is their evidence. Yes, through the laser cutting of the bricks. So it's just so many things we keep finding, and another year will go by or 2 years, and they'll find another giant heap of pictures of the old world. And one of the things, a good clue is if you watch really old black and white cowboy movies from the 30s, 40s, 50s, you'll see a lot of this old world kind of remnants as they're riding their horses by and stuff. And that's another, a video for another day because I have tons of these old black and white cowboy movies. But when you go through them, you'll see more evidence of the giant trees, the giant fossilized people, the destruction, the old world, everything gets blamed. This was made for the Civil War, and then it was destroyed by the North or the South or whatever. And another thing in the pictures, you see just large, flat landscapes with the trees all like the trees are burnt, but they're burnt, but they're still standing. It's not like the buildings that are brick that are completely destroyed. And we see this through, if it's not the great fires throughout the United States, it's just like the same. Anything that wasn't destroyed after the Civil War or during the Civil War, they melted down with these great fires. And when North America was to a point where they could sign off on the reset, then they would move to Europe. And this is a big part of the World War I, World War II narratives. Now, they burn out these buildings and they consolidate the wealth and conceal the evidence. So, in this picture, you can see all these giant boxes are safes with gold coins in them because this would have been before their Federal Reserve banking system where the standard was gold and silver coins. So, they burn down these buildings, they find the safe in the basement, wherever, they bring it out and set it down. But this is how they consolidate the wealth after these massive reset events. And all the people would be destroyed. Maybe there wasn't even people in these cities to begin with. Maybe they were always just empty. They melt them down. Then they send in people to, consolidate the wealth into, whatever they are doing. So very, very interesting. The secret information many are not aware of is the technology mastered for a breakaway civilization developed between 1820, 1850, and 1890. Now, how this was made possible was by the back engineering of the old world technology. Now, this was all a free energy society. They had anti gravity, they had life extension, they had cloning of artificial beings, and from this back engineered technology, the controllers could bribe anyone, promise them almost anything, from longer life to the access of some of these hidden facilities and underground super cities to a civilian of the 1850s, 1900s time period. It would seem like magic or the work of demonic entities or something. So even today, many are incapable of even imagining what may lay beneath the surface of our realm. And it's said that you picture these deep underground bases as just like a cave. The walls are gray. They're either concrete or they're rock, and it's just military, bunkers in there with cots and things like that. But the secret rumor is they're all like it's marble, it's super old world. Everything is perfect, and it's like structures that existed before these resets took place. And they would not need to really destroy them or cover them up because they could just put a military base on the entrance, and no one's ever getting in. So it's a big, interesting thing is when are the pictures of what's underground going to be released to the people? Because eventually this is all going to come out. Someone's going to blow the whistle. Someone's going to figure out a way to get this information out to the researchers, and then it will have to be acknowledged by the controllers who create the narratives. Now, we go back further and further, and we see tons of these airships and these zeppelins, and when people today would see sightings of these cigar-shaped UFOs and stuff, most likely it's a furthered advanced technology of this old world technology. And you could see what were these giant towers for. Most likely radio communication with these airships, radio communications over the ice wall, whatever it may be. You see the Central Park, you see New York, you see all these cities with very, very limited amount of people. And if they weren't going to fully populate the city, they would end up using their great fires to burn them all down and hide them and conceal them. And it's just more mystery without, the anybody who's a professional or an expert will never weigh in on any of these topics, any of these ideas, any of this kind of idea of airships. Everyone knows about the Zeppelin that crashed and oh, the humanity. And that was like a false flag to record how dangerous these giant airships that just float around are. And, like airplanes would never, ever crash. When in reality, far more airplanes crash than these. Because if something happened on one of these giant airships, they would just float down and people would get off of them. It's not like an airplane that when the engines die, you're going straight into the ground. Very interesting. There is an idea that these, are they're filled with helium, they're filled with hydrogen. There is another theory that they use anti-gravity type of levitation and propulsion using, electricity current. They pump the electricity into the outer shell, which causes like a magnetic levitation sort of a thing. And that's I cover a lot of this in my Scenario Aero Club video. If you've seen that, that kind of gets into farther back in our timeline of how all these sightings were documented of these airships, of different kinds of anomalies and lights in the sky by people who, if you didn't have electricity or power and it gets really dark out in the country, you would really notice flying lights in the sky and things like that. So then you just see like pictures of this super massive, massive area, cargo hold or something. And, are these people waiting to get shipped out? A lot of this just doesn't make sense that people would all gather into this little area unless they were trying to escape something. And, it just, we find more information, more evidence, and we kind of have to make of it what we make of it because you're never going to get anyone in the official realm telling us anything. Now, here's one of these airships moving one of these super megalithic, hundreds of ton rocks, just hooked on with these airships moving it. Now, that would lead me to believe that it's not hot air in there. It's a type of anti gravity that they could lift super heavy objects and transport them. Now, if you get multiple of these airships, could you transport full buildings and stuff? All of these things have to be thought about and theorized more because of kind of what didn't get destroyed in the fire. I mean, how much would this giant obelisk weigh? These airships are just very easily maneuvering them and steering them and things like that. Interesting, interesting stuff. And what caused these resets? Were there super explosives used by other inhabitants in other realms? Or it just, so many questions come to mind when we look at this. And that's why this mud flood is such a massive part of our research.